Hello, everyone, and you're very welcome to today's webinar featuring our guest, Dr. Angela Carlin. And the topic of today's webinar is children's physical activity. What is the current state of play? As a brief introduction, Dr. Carlin is a senior lecturer in exercise and health at Ulster University. Her research focuses on developing and evaluating interventions to promote physical activity in children and adolescents, exploring the determinants of physical activity across the life cycle, and leveraging technology to encourage physical activity and reduce sedentary behaviour. Dr. Carlin has contributed to numerous national and international research projects, which I'm sure she will highlight during her talk today. Additionally, she serves as the Impact Champion for the School of Sport and Exercise Science, reflecting her expertise in producing research that creates meaningful change for individuals and society. Lastly, on a personal note, she's a wonderful colleague of mine, and I'm really looking forward to her presentation today. Just before I hand over to Angela, I'd just like to remind and to invite members of the audience that if you do have a question for Angela during today's session, if you could please pop that into the Q&A area, that would be very much appreciated. So, Angela, I'm really looking forward to this. Over to you.
That all's good with slides?
Yes, I can
Yeah,
hear you and I can see the slides. Thanks, Angela.
perfect. Thanks a million. And thank you so much, Carla, for that lovely introduction. And thanks, obviously, to the Irish Sport and Exercise Association for the invitation to contribute to this afternoon's webinar. Probably like most of you, is nearly at the finish line for Christmas. I'm dosed with the cold, so I do apologise for that, but hopefully we'll make it through the next 30 or 40 minutes. So as Carla has alluded to, my talk today is going to be focused on children's physical activity across the island of Ireland. And throughout the webinar, we hope to answer the question, what is the current state of play in relation to children's physical activity? So within the talk, I'll first off start by probably a revision for most of us, what we mean when we talk about physical activity and some of the other key concepts, briefly outlining the evidence base for the health benefits of physical activity in this population, and then outline and define what the current guidelines are for physical activity in children and adolescents, which will then allow us to look into the most recent research we have to really evaluate whether children and adolescents are meeting these guidelines. Towards the end of the talk, then, I'll touch briefly on the evidence base in relation to promoting physical activity in this population, i.e., what works, what are our best investments when it comes to trying to promote physical activity. And then finally, time permitting, speak a little bit about some of the current research that we have ongoing on children's physical activity at Ulster University. So as I'm sure we're all aware, the definition, physical activity is any bodily movement produced by the skeletal muscles that requires energy expenditure. And physical activity takes place in, I guess, categories, or as we refer to, domains. So for children and adolescents, these domains are transportation, physical education, recreation and leisure, and household chores. And children and adolescents tend to accumulate their physical activity across three main settings: the home environment, educational institutions, and then obviously the community and the wider environment. Alongside physical activity, then, physical activity sits on what we refer to then as a continuum. So that definition that I previously talked about, light physical activity, physical activity can be categorized as light, moderate, or vigorous. But we have another behavior that sits alongside physical activity on this continuum. And although it is distinct, sedentary behavior is another important concept just to outline at the beginning of the presentation, because the two are usually talked about hand in hand when it comes to evaluating the overall status of children's physical activity. So sedentary behaviour, importantly, is defined as any waking activity, but this is characterised by a low energy expenditure, so an expenditure of less than 1.5 metabolic equivalents, and importantly, a sitting or a reclining posture. So for the majority of today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on physical activity in children and adolescents, but I will talk briefly about the guidelines for sedentary behaviour and pick up on some statistics and trends in relation to that as well. So in terms of how much physical activity our children and adolescents should be doing, our physical activity guidelines are produced at an international or global level by the WHO, the World Health Organization, and their most recent guidelines for both physical activity and sedentary behaviour were released in 2020. These guidelines cover all aspects of the life cycle, as you see demonstrated on the infographic on the slide. But whenever we focus specifically in on the focus of today's talk, our children and adolescents, there's a number of key aspects I want to draw your attention to. Like the guidelines for the overall population, there's recommendations that this age group limit their time in sedentary behaviour, that they replace that with some physical activity, with the message really being that any movement or any physical activity is better than none. And then looking specifically at the volume or the amount of physical activity for this age group, so children and adolescents aged 5 to 18 years, they should be accumulating on average at least 60 minutes per day of physical activity. So looking into that in a bit more detail, those guidelines firstly refer to the amount of physical activity. So that is, as I say, an average of 60 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity across the week. And it's an important distinction to make. That guideline has been updated now to include the word average. So previously it would have been a daily threshold of 60 minutes per day, but it's now an average accumulated across the week that works out at least 60 minutes per day. And that is referred to by WHO as a strong recommendation because there is a moderate certainty evidence base behind that. Likewise is the recommendation in relation to muscle and bone strengthening activities. So for this particular component of the guidelines, children and adolescents are recommended to incorporate this on at least 3 days per week. And then, as I alluded to on the previous infographic, this age group are also recommended to limit the amount of time spent being sedentary, particularly the amount of recreational screen time that they engage in. That again is a strong recommendation from the guidelines. However, the evidence base there is of a lower certainty, and that's partly due just to the emergence of sedentary behaviour as a newer focus of the research. There's just not the same body of evidence that exists for sedentary behaviour in this population that we have for physical activity and muscle and bone strengthening. So that's the international perspective on the guidelines from the WHO. But as part of the Global Action Plan, individual countries are also recommended and advised to develop and implement their own physical activity guidelines. So across the island of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, we have the UK Chief Medical Officer's guidelines produced across the UK. The most recent version of these published in 2019. And then for Ireland, we have the newly released just in March of this year, Every Move Counts National Physical Activity Guidelines. The content of both of these guideline documents largely reflects and mirrors what is set out in the WHO guidelines as well. So there aren't many discrepancies across the individual countries. And where these amounts come from, where these daily thresholds, these sentences in relation to intensity, the components and so on come from, is the evidence base that shows us the health benefits that can be accrued if children and adolescents actually meet these recommended levels of physical activity. So we have a strong evidence base that shows that meeting those guidelines will improve physical fitness in our children and adolescents. Primarily here, the research has focused on cardiorespiratory and muscular strength. There's also a substantial body of evidence to support the benefits in relation to cardiometabolic and bone health. For children and adolescents, we also have a sound evidence base in relation to cognitive outcomes. And as you can imagine, in this population, a lot of that research has tended to focus on academic outcomes and performance. We also have a body of evidence, not now as established as we would have for adult populations, in relation to the role that physical activity can play in terms of supporting positive mental health in this population. And then finally, we have evidence to highlight the role that it can play in terms of weight management, with links associated with reduced adiposity in this age group. So now we're all hopefully a bit more aware of how much physical activity our children and adolescents should be doing. I want to take a bit of time then and highlight some of the recent data we have that indicates how well we're doing at actually achieving these physical activity guidelines, and then as a consequence, ensuring that our children and young people are achieving all of those associated health benefits. So we'll start off firstly just at the international level. So this is the most recent, I guess, global level data that we have, and this is a huge sample of evidence. So this is a pooled study from over 290 studies worldwide, looking at surveys across countries and pulling all of the data to really give us an international picture on how well, or as the case is, not well we're doing in terms of children and adolescents meeting the guidelines. So just to clarify, you might immediately look at those bars and see lots of high percentages. This data is actually showing us the prevalence of physical inactivity in youth. So when we talk about physical inactivity, that essentially is defined as not meeting the physical activity guidelines. So we talk about groups being physically active, they're meeting the guidelines. physical inactivity is not achieving those WHO or those national guidelines. And long story short, regardless of all the data that's there on the slide, the picture is pretty clear. At a global level, 81% of children aged 11 to 17 years are not meeting the physical activity guidelines. And when you look at the data across income category by countries, there's not really much variation in that either, which this study demonstrated. What this study also highlights, and I'll pick it up a bit later on as well in terms of the focus of some of our research, is there's a real gender gap when it comes to the prevalence of meeting those physical activity guidelines. As you see there illustrated in the text box, 77.6% of boys were insufficiently active, compared with a much higher proportion of girls, 84.7%. And that's something we consistently see reflected in surveillance data. So that's just a snapshot, I guess, of the global prevalence of physical inactivity. So now I'm going to take us a bit closer to home and highlight some of the surveillance work that has been ongoing across the island of Ireland. So I'd like to take a few minutes to talk through the ISESA study, which a number of you on the webinar this afternoon are probably familiar with or indeed have been involved with. So this is an all-island study that has been conducted now over a number of iterations. The first rollout of ISESA was conducted in the Republic of Ireland only, but the more recent versions have expanded now to become an all-island study, which is great in terms of representativeness and gives us a great picture of children's physical activity across the island. So the most recent version of ISESA was conducted in 2022, and it's coordinated across 4 research centres, so the University of Limerick, University College Cork, Dublin City University, and Ulster University. And as you can see there from the numbers on the slide, it involved recruiting almost 9,000 children aged 10 to 19 years from both primary and post-primary schools. In terms of what this study seeks to look at then, so it's a survey-based surveillance of children's physical activity, and it seeks to measure both the behaviours themselves, but also importantly, the attitudes that children have in relation to these. So it captures information in relation to physical activity, community sport, school sport, PE, active travel, and then also contemporary issues in relation to physical activity. So for example, the most recent version conducted in 2022 looked at additional measures and questions in relation to children's perceptions of the impact of COVID-19 on their physical activity, and also looked at considerations around their perceptions and use of wearable technologies and the role that they might play in relation to physical activity. The survey obviously gives us an indication of the overall population's participation in physical activity, but it also collects a range of demographic characteristics as well, which allow us to really tap in and look at those differences in relation to gender, which I've previously highlighted, and other demographic characteristics as well, such as socioeconomic status, urban versus rural, and so on. So there are lots and lots of data available based on the most recent version of the ISESA study, but I just wanted to, I suppose, pull out and highlight some of the key findings. And what I've done for these then is offered a comparison in terms of the Northern Ireland perspective compared then to the Republic of Ireland. So if we look to overall physical activity first, we know now obviously that we should be aiming for that on average 60 minutes per day of physical activity. And as we can see across both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, we have a fairly low percentage or proportion of our children and adolescents meeting this guideline. And I should say the age range in this study is 10 to 19 years of age. So it's the older children and the adolescence period. I guess some good news, because there's not an awful lot of good news when we talk about children's physical activity participation. We have observed some slight improvements compared to the previous version of the survey in 2018. So if we look, for example, at post-primary in both the north and the south, you can see small incremental improvements there in relation to overall physical activity, but we're nowhere near even a fifth meeting the guidelines. So there's still a huge amount of work to be done there. Looking at other aspects or other domains, I guess, of physical activity in this population then, whilst we see maybe some consistency in the data for overall physical activity, there are clear trends or differences that emerge across the jurisdictions when we look at some of these specific domains, active travel being one which really illustrates this point. So we see fairly comparable levels of active travel amongst primary school children in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And again, we've observed marginal or slight improvements there since the 2018 survey. However, when we look to active travel then in post-primary, we can see that although there has been a decline in the Republic of Ireland, this still sits well above the proportion of children and adolescents in Northern Ireland, meeting that with just 18% of adolescents in Northern Ireland actively commuting. There are a number, I guess, of factors that might contribute to that, but I suppose one of the main contextual ones is just differences in terms of the educational setup across the two jurisdictions, whereby it's fairly common in Northern Ireland for children to bypass two or three or indeed four of their nearest proximity schools in order to attend a school of a certain status, perhaps linked to academic selection and so on. So whilst it doesn't explain the whole picture, it's probably an important contextual factor that differs across the two jurisdictions. Sticking with the school environment then, and looking this time at physical education, the infographics here highlight the average physical education minutes per week in schools. And again, we can see quite variation both across jurisdictions and across the primary and the post-primary sectors as well, with the data highlighting that generally speaking, schools in the Republic of Ireland, children there are more likely to meet the recommended levels. However, it is worth noting that the recommended levels are lower in the Republic compared to Northern Ireland. And then just to touch briefly on sedentary behaviour, the study also covered this in detail. And what we see here is the proportion of children and adolescents who spend 2 hours a day or more on various types of sedentary behaviours. You can see this looks at various categories of sedentary behaviours: video gaming, TV viewing, mobile phone use, and so on. And we can see quite clearly from the bar charts there's distinctions or differences across age. So when they move into post-primary, an increase, for example, in mobile phone use. But we also see quite contrasting gender differences in terms of engagement in sedentary behaviour, with boys more likely to engage in video gaming, whereas girls are more likely to report higher volumes of TV viewing and mobile phone use. So very much just a snapshot, and there's a large detailed report that delves into that data in much more detail and highlights in further detail age-related, gender, socioeconomic differences, and so on. Another study that I just wanted to briefly highlight then, albeit it's a little bit dated at this point, is a study called the Millennium Cohort Study. Now, this was just collected in participants in Northern Ireland, but I just wanted to flag this because it's one of the few representative surveys or studies we have that uses device-based measurement of physical activity. So CISPA obviously is survey-based and relies on self-report measures. This is an example then of a device-based study. So this was conducted across the UK. It had a sample of 6,500 7 to 8 year olds for this particular stage of the study. And based on device measured physical activity, so these participants were all wearing accelerometers, only 51% of participants were meeting the Chief Medical Officer's guidelines. And I should note, obviously, this is a younger sample size, so 7 to 8 year olds, whereas CISPA obviously is slightly older. What the study also starkly demonstrated was significant differences in levels of physical activity between girls and boys. And I suppose worryingly for us, where we sit geographically, children in Northern Ireland were identified as the least likely to meet the physical activity guidelines. So compared to their counterparts across the other home nations of the UK, just 43% of the 7 to 8 year olds here were meeting the guidelines. So we hopefully now have a bit of an understanding that there's quite a long way to go in terms of getting our children and adolescents towards meeting those physical activity guidelines that we've previously highlighted. On the back, I suppose, of presenting some of that information and some of that data from recent studies, I thought it would be useful as well to maybe highlight and pick up some of the challenges that we experience as researchers when it comes to actually measuring physical activity in this population. So many of the studies that we have, particularly those large scale population based surveillance studies, as you can imagine, typically have to rely on self report and subjective measures due to the practicalities of conducting those types of studies. And we are probably all well aware, regardless of what field or discipline we work in, the challenges when it comes to relying on self reported or subjective measures. And I guess when we think about physical activity, there are a number of limitations, but these might actually become more pronounced given the fact that we're interested in conducting these measurements in children and adolescents. So, one of the first issues, I guess, that springs to mind is the issue of recall. So we know ourselves as adults, there probably are issues when it comes to our ability to accurately recall information, but the evidence clearly shows us that particularly in younger children, they don't actually possess the cognitive abilities to be able to do that accurately. So as a result, it's really only appropriate for us to use those questionnaire-based instruments in older children and adolescents. That subsequently means that if we need to rely on self-report measures for those younger populations, we have to go to the next available source of the information and instead use proxy measures, so i.e. asking a parent or a guardian to complete the questionnaire on behalf of their child. As you can imagine, then some limitations present themselves there also, namely if parents or guardians are not spending the full portion of the day with the child. That then obviously limits their ability to accurately present information on their physical activity. And then the final aspect that makes measuring children's physical activity challenging from a self-report point of view is the very nature of activity that children and adolescents tend to undertake. So if we all think about our own physical activity, for the most part, it's probably planned to an extent, and it's also fairly structured. So at the end of the day, we're probably able to quantify ourselves, how much we walked, if we went to the gym, if we were undertaking sport and so on. But if you think back, or if you have any younger relatives or children running about, you will know by very nature, children, particularly younger children's physical activity, is often very sporadic and very intermittent in its nature, and that therefore makes it quite difficult to capture from a self-report point of view. So, to try and address some of the limitations that exist with subjective or self report measures, we have then, like most fields, more, I guess, technology developed and device based measurements that we can look to. But these, again, are not without their challenges. And again, I just wanted to highlight and reflect on some of these, again, in the population that we're looking at today. If anyone on the call has worked and done research in this population, I won't need to tell you too much about the challenges of wear time compliance when working with children and adolescents. So trying to get them to wear accelerometers or other devices to actually get them wearing it for long enough that we can actually use the data and get an accurate picture of their physical activity habits. And there's bodies of research looking just at how you go about improving that and promoting that. The next thing is obviously cost. So cost, obviously these devices are expensive, both to administer and the processing and software analysis and everything that goes alongside them. So that obviously can be a limitation for a number of research studies where resources might be restricted. And then finally, although they do address some of the limitations of self-report, for example, they can allow us to look more at exercise or physical activity intensity. Dependent on the type of device or accelerometer used, they won't necessarily capture all types of physical activity in children and adolescents. So, for example, some accelerometer models are not waterproof, which means they have to be removed for water-based activities. So, if you have a child or a group of children whereby swimming or another water-based activity is one of their main contributors to their overall physical activity, that's only obviously going to have a significant implication in terms of the validity of that data. And also, the placement of the device will have implications on how good it is at picking up, for example, movement of the lower limbs or the upper limbs and so on. So neither are perfect, but there's just a couple of particular methodological challenges that are worth highlighting when we're talking specifically today about children and adolescents. And very briefly, then, what about sedentary behaviour? So, I guess we rely on similar measurement tools when it comes to looking at sedentary behaviour, both our subjective and our device-based measures. But there are a few additional complexities, I guess, when it comes to measuring sedentary behaviour in this population. Not least is us as researchers trying to keep up to speed with the technological developments and advancements that are happening, which in turn might mean that some of our particularly questionnaire-based tools actually become out of date quite quickly. So if you look at, for example, the early literature in relation to sedentary behaviour, you will see a lot of studies using television viewing as a proxy measure and a way of quantifying sedentary behaviour. But even if we think about our own TV viewing habits nowadays, it's perhaps not the case that we all sit traditionally in front of a TV and consume media in that way. And that's the case, obviously, in our younger populations as well. Some of the other challenges are if we move then from TV viewing to screen time, we are perhaps consuming multiple screens at once. Is all screen time sedentary? And again, thinking about children and adolescents, there's probably a shift now to the use of screens and apps and technologies to facilitate learning and indeed actually to facilitate physical activity as well. And you can see some examples there illustrated on the slide. So could probably talk to all of that for an hour alone, but it's just some food for thought maybe when you're looking at the evidence and considering perhaps how you might be using these measurements within your own fields of work. Another study then that I wanted to talk about a bit today gives us a bit of a broader perspective in terms of physical activity across the island of Ireland. And this is the Ireland North and South Report Card on Children's Physical Activity. So this is part of an international collaboration. And our most recent report card was released in 2022. So it really does what it says on the tin. It's a report card that looks across a range of indicators related to children's physical activity and essentially assigns a grade against them. And it is repeated so that we're able to track and monitor progress and changes over periods of time. And what our Ireland report card aims to do is really serve as a tool for both practitioners and policymakers to provoke changes in both priorities and practice, to identify the key needs and gaps that exist in relation to children's physical activity, and importantly, then, given the low prevalence of physical activity that we have, to advocate for and allocate funds to children's physical activity promotion initiatives. So our most recent report card, as I say, took place in 2022, and Ireland sat within this international research collaboration, which is referred to as the Global Matrix. So there were 57 countries worldwide that participated in this report card process. So it's an international methodological process that we follow, and our grades and data and all of that are audited by this Global Matrix organization. So if I can just draw your attention to the box in the center of the slide, these are the physical activity indicators, or if we think about a school report, the subjects that we look at to see how well we're doing when it comes to children's physical activity. So you see a wide range, both behavioural and also sources of influence that we look at. And essentially then we look at all of the available data that we have across the island of Ireland in relation to these indicators. So this just gives you a snapshot of the data sources that contributed to the most recent version of the report card that we published in 2022. So CISPA, for example, is an example of a really good all-island study that we have that would contribute to our report card. But given the wide range of indicators, we have to look to other sources of data as well. Some of these which are maybe only available in one jurisdiction. So you see, for example, the Northern Ireland only data sources there in the purple, the Republic of Ireland in the green, and then the all-island in the blue. So all of these studies were brought together and used to really assess the state of play in terms of children's physical activity across each of the indicators. In terms of, I guess, developments and advancements with our report card process then, so this was the third time Ireland had been involved in the Global Matrix. And what was a really exciting development for us this time around was that this was the first time we were able to consider and produce a set of grades specifically for children and adolescents with disabilities across the island of Ireland. And I'll be highlighting some of those findings in a moment. But this is where I guess we were really to the fore. So if you remember, I said there was 57 countries worldwide participated in this Global Matrix. Only about 20 of those countries actually progressed and produced data specifically, or grades, sorry, specifically for children and adolescents with disabilities. So it was great to be able to make that progress within our all-island report card team. The next few slides then highlight, I guess, our report card. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these in detail, but I'll just sort of give an example just to sort of explain how the process works. So you'll see there overall physical activity is the first indicator presented on the slide. And you can see our grades from our two previous iterations in 2014 and 2016, and then our new set of grades published in 2022. And as I've identified, we have our main grades and then a separate set of grades for children and adolescents with disability. Excuse me. So essentially, each of those indicators has a benchmark set against it, i.e., what our children and adolescents should be doing. And then we look to the data and say, right, A plus if they're pretty much all meeting the guideline, down to an F or not graded if there's a lack of progress being made. So for overall physical activity, the benchmark would have been the proportion meeting that physical activity guideline. And probably on the back of some of the trends I've previously highlighted, we are making some progress in relation to that across the island. And there was a slight increase in our grades. And we've naturally been moving on an upward trajectory there across the three iterations of the report card. Albeit a C minus is still not top of the class. We still have quite a bit of work to do, but at least moving in the right direction. I guess, though, where the concern emerged here was whenever we presented our grade for disability. So whilst there is a good news story here, unfortunately, the grade for children and adolescents with disabilities was an F, highlighting that we're succeeding with fewer than 20% of our children and adolescents with disabilities. So it was so important for us to be able to present these grades to provide a clear picture of the gaps and disparities that exist there in terms of our grades. As I say, there's that available data then across all of the different indicators, and I'll signpost you if you'd like further information on that. But just to flag, if you see the ink here, that refers to inconclusive. So basically, we don't have enough available data for those particular indicators, and that's another useful consequence of the report card, and that it can highlight to us where the gaps are in terms of availability of data across the island. So again, that's just the further indicators there. In terms of our key recommendations on the back of that work then in 2022, it was really to continue to develop policy measures that will address the inequalities that we'd highlighted. And I guess this time we had a real specific call focusing on children and adolescents with disabilities, because the first time we had clear evidence there on the difference in the disparities in grades across the two. Furthermore, because the report card does identify where the gaps are, I guess this report card seeks as a sort of call to research as well in terms of addressing where those gaps exist. So, for example, we have quite limited data across the island in relation to active play, and for subgroups of children and adolescents as well. We typically have to rely on data from older children and adolescents. We don't have a lot in the early years and those early stages of primary education as well. It is also worth flagging that that report card did not consider the impact of the impact of COVID-19 across that range of indicators. And that's something that we will be considering hopefully in the next iteration of the report card, which we aim to get off the ground early in the new year. If you'd like any more information on that, or want to take a bit more time to look through the grades, the website is there on the slides, and that contains our full reports as well if you'd like any further info on that. So moving on, we're getting through. I'd like to just briefly highlight, I guess, in terms of promoting physical activity in this population, what the evidence shows us actually works. So what are our best investments and our best uses of money when it comes to promoting physical activity in this population? So many of you will be familiar with the Global Action Plan for Physical Activity, and this outlines 4 strategic objectives when it comes to increasing population levels of physical activity, looking at societies, environments, people, and systems. And in order to facilitate the translation of this Global Action Plan, ISPA, so the International Society for Physical Activity and Health, has identified 8 key investments that can really be used to try and respond to the current pandemic of physical inactivity. So this is where the evidence base and the research has shown us are, I guess, the best buys, the areas that we should be targeting when it comes to trying to promote physical activity. And obviously today focused promoting physical activity in children and adolescents. As we might expect, there's no easy solution. There's no one quick fix to all of this. And really, that's what the 8 investments tries to illustrate and put across. So there shouldn't be a focus placed on just one aspect of this, or indeed one sub aspect of these investments to try and shift the needle in relation to physical inactivity. It's a combination of investments that are required, and really a shift and a move towards a systems-based approach to try and address population levels of physical inactivity. But if we look to the 8 investments that are highlighted on the infographic, you can see that many of these relate directly to children and adolescents. And I suppose just given my background and focus of my research, the one that I wanted to pull out for now is whole of school programs. So there's a substantial body of evidence that suggests that these should be a key focus and a key priority of efforts to promote physical activity in this population. The benefits are that they would engage whole school communities. They should provide students with multiple physical activity opportunities. And in addition to promoting the health benefits, we will also observe the wider benefits then that can be achieved from physical activity, for example, related to academic achievement and classroom behaviours. Another key thing that sits alongside that and has really, I guess, emerged across maybe the last 10 to 15 years in the field is, whilst we have all of the best available evidence and telling us what we should and what we shouldn't do, there has been a real shift, and probably rightly so, to recognising and listening to the views and values and experiences of young people themselves when it comes to understanding how we actually get them to be more physically active. So the concept, or the term PPI, you may have heard before, relates to patient and public involvement. And it has really been identified over the last decade or so in the field as a real integral part of the research process. So it really requires us as researchers to sort of shift how we do our research. So rather than doing it for them, it's about them and with them, and really participating and including them from the very, very outset of our research. And there's a significant body of evidence behind this, I guess, to demonstrate the role that PPI can play. So by involving young people, obviously it gives a unique perspective on the design, the conduct, and the interpretation of research, but some evidence has also demonstrated actually it can enhance the quality and the relevance of the research as well. And for any of you on the call who are researchers, you will know that it is pretty much a requirement now from funding bodies as well to actively show how you're doing PPI with your work. But it's something that we've really tried to build in within our own research, and I'll allude to that in the next few slides. But it goes hand in hand with the evidence base, actually listening to the views and experiences of young people themselves to ensure we're designing and developing programs, initiatives, schemes, and so on that they're actually going to be interested in, and we'll get the buy-in from them. So for the the last bit of the talk, then, I'd like to just tell you a little bit more about some of the current research that we have ongoing at Ulster University in relation to children's physical activity. So it's, I suppose, my main area of research, and our research in this area relates, I suppose, to both school-based physical activity, so the design and development and evaluation of interventions, and then also the surveillance and monitoring. So colleagues have been involved, for example, in CISPA, and we led the most recent report card. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these interventions, but if any of them there catch your eye, or you've maybe heard about the international versions of them before, do please feel free to reach out after the webinar today, and we'll be happy to chat through those in more detail. So the one I just wanted to pick up and talk a bit about today was the WISH study. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that study and highlight some of our key findings and importantly learnings from that study, as we've been sort of dedicated to that area of research now for probably the last 10 to 12 years. So very briefly, just by a way of background, the WISH study, or the Walking in Schools intervention, started out as part of my PhD program of research. So I still say a couple of years ago. I think I now have to stretch that out because it's it's a good decade ago now, so I can't use that anymore. But I guess throughout that program of research, we conducted a series of studies to really try and build and develop an evidence base for physical activity, particularly walking-based interventions in this population. So we followed, I guess, what the frameworks and the guidance tell us to do in relation to the design of interventions. So actually look at the evidence that exists already, and we done that by conducting a systematic review of existing walk-in interventions. And we also then conducted qualitative research. So actually conducting focus groups and asking this age group, 11 to 13-year-olds, what they liked about physical activity, what they disliked, and what would be appropriate interventions to be developed to try and increase physical activity. And from that body of work, I guess, alongside the existing evidence that showed us there's a real lack of physical activity opportunities for adolescent females. So we see consistently from the surveillance data, they're less likely to meet the physical activity guidelines. And through this qualitative work, we really gleaned or learned from them that there was a lack of opportunities for non-competitive, unstructured, informal opportunities for physical activity. And we asked them where they wanted to do this physical activity. They indicated their preference was within the school setting because they could still be active with their friends. There was that social support aspect to it, but that they didn't want the traditional offerings that were there, highlighting that extracurricular activities tended to reflect the structured and organised nature of PE, and there wasn't really a lot for the non-sporty children, I guess, within the school environment. So from all of that information, then we developed a pilot study, which was the peer-led walking in schools intervention. And this was conducted in a sample of post-primary schools in Northern Ireland over a 12-week period. And what that pilot study done was demonstrated effectiveness. So we found that there was an increase in levels of light intensity physical activity across the school day, and subsequently a decrease in levels of sedentary behaviour, demonstrating that the development of a walk-in intervention within the school setting was effective. But if any of you on the call are from a research background, you'll know that that's really the first step in terms of demonstrating the effectiveness in order to move this towards a wider rollout. So on the back of all of that initial work, we then moved on to conduct a fully powered randomized control trial. And the aim of this, it's a mouthful, was to evaluate the effectiveness of a novel, low cost, peer-led, school-based walking intervention delivered across the school year. So study design, I'll just talk to this very, very briefly, but it is important, I guess, from a contextual point of view to highlight that initially this study was planned to be conducted over two phases. So from September 2019 and then phase two in September 2020. I don't think I need to tell anyone what happened in the middle of all of that. But safe to say, it significantly derailed and disrupted our research plans. And it does have implications, I guess, when we move on to highlight some of the findings of the intervention. So we had to go with this a few times. And eventually, thankfully, we were able to roll out the study then in phase three in 2021 and 2022. But rather than being split across 2 school years, we had to recruit all of our schools and run the intervention within the 1 year. So we were very busy to say the least. So the infographic there just highlights the key stages of the study. So recruitment of our schools, and where this differed was that we recruited schools this time across Northern Ireland and the border regions of the Republic of Ireland as well. So we expanded to be a cross-border trial. We conducted a range of outcome measures, a baseline follow-up, and a post-intervention period after. And then obviously schools were allocated to either undertake the intervention or the control. So very briefly, the WISH intervention involved training older pupils aged 15 to 18 years to train as walk leaders. And this training was based on the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland's Walking for Health training, which is delivered to adult walking groups across Northern Ireland. The format was that schools were instructed to provide 10 to 15-minute walks before school and at recess periods across the school day. So these walks were targeted at adolescents aged 11 to 13 and delivered by their older peer leaders. The walks took place primarily within the school grounds. Walk leaders were asked to complete checklists, and participants themselves were given reward cards and incentives for taking part in the intervention. And building upon the pilot study, which was a 12-week intervention, this walking trial was conducted over a longer period, so 18 to 20 weeks across the school year. As I had highlighted a bit earlier, then we were keen to integrate the views and experiences of young people from the outset of this trial. And a real strength of the study was then the engagement in the PPI activities that we had throughout. And the slide there just gives you a snapshot of some of those activities. So at the outset of the study, we had our youth advisory groups come on to campus and give us insights and views and reflections on our recruitment materials, how we propose going into schools to recruit, and any issues or challenges they might have foreseen with how we actually plan to develop the interventions. You can see from the picture there, we also asked them to have a go at designing the half zips that we would be giving out. We didn't go with the rainbow in the end, but it was my favourite. Moving on then, as we progressed and conducted the study itself, we were more keen then to glean their experiences actually of being participants in the trial and what we could do in relation to that. And as we tried to pivot and think about how our trial would work in the context of COVID, we used them as a sounding board of how their school environment looked now and what we could do really to contingency plan and ensure that the intervention could work around those COVID restrictions. And then our final youth advisory groups that we held last year were really focused around dissemination. So how would we best get this information out? And they had some really useful ideas and perspectives there in terms of how we communicate, obviously, to non-academic audiences, the findings of our research. So just want to briefly highlight then some of the findings. So our primary outcome, the thing that we were looking to change within this study was increasing moderate to vigorous physical activity. And unfortunately, across the intervention period and the 1 year follow-up, we didn't observe any statistical differences between our groups at any time point. So the intervention failed to produce effect when it came to moderate to vigorous physical activity in this population. And the picture was unfortunately the same when it came to our secondary outcomes. So again, we didn't observe any differences across our groups in relation to sleep, social media use, body image, emotional regulation, and so on. In order to help us try and understand this, we then looked to our process evaluation, and we conducted a wide range of measures here in relation to the RE-AIM framework, which you'll see illustrated on the slide. So we had all of this planned from the outset of the study, but I guess this information all became even more important then with the lack of any notable differences observed between the groups at follow-up. We really wanted to dive in and try and understand what the reasons were, given that the pilot study had demonstrated some initial effectiveness. And this graph gives us, I guess, a messy snapshot of what really happens whenever we try to do research in schools. So what this graph demonstrates is the number of walks that were delivered across a proportion of our intervention schools. So all intervention schools were given the same training, the same supports, the same instructions, asked to deliver X number of walks a day for X number of weeks and so on. But this graph, I think, just nicely summarizes just how busy and how messy schools-based research can be, and indeed how schools can be. So we observed huge variation across our intervention schools in terms of the implementation of our intervention, which probably goes some way to explaining why we didn't observe changes in physical activity, because it's clear that some schools were much better or much more able than others to actually implement the intervention. And this is something that we're seeing reflected in a lot of the school-based literature at the minute. And there has been a shift, really, I guess, in the last couple of years in terms of how we approach and think about school-based research and school-based interventions related to physical activity. It's becoming quite apparent from the research and the literature that a one-size-fits-all approach does not work. And there's a real need, as highlighted in this nice paper led by Russ Yago and colleagues, to rethink interventions at the school level and really consider the context of the school environment and giving schools options in terms of how they implement and deliver interventions within the school setting. So we're trying to shift and pivot, I guess, the way that we approach our research studies to take that into account. I'll just finish up then by highlighting a study that we have ongoing at the moment. So I've probably talked a bit today about the gender differences in relation to physical activity, but another aspect that we could highlight disparities in relation to is socioeconomic status and physical activity. And I suppose it's something that we've become mindful of, particularly over the last couple of years with the cost of living crisis that we are facing as a society. So a colleague of mine, Dr. Maria O'Kane, is leading some really exciting research at Ulster at the minute that we're involved in, looking specifically at the impact of the cost of living crisis on children's physical activity. So this work is currently under review. So just to flag, these findings are not published at the minute. But really what we sought to look at this study was really try and get an understanding of the impact of the cost of living crisis, particularly in relation to sport and physical activity opportunities for children and adolescents across Northern Ireland at this stage. We had heard lots of things anecdotally, so we wanted to try and follow up and actually have an evidence base to support that information. So we conducted an online survey with parents and guardians of children aged 4 to 16 years across Northern Ireland. And as you can see from the graph here, we had an excellent representation in terms of our response rate, participants from all of the council areas across Northern Ireland. So we had over 800 parents or guardians that responded to this survey. It is worth highlighting, though, that we probably have a number of sources, not necessarily biased, but a number of key things to consider in terms of the demographic profile that actually responded to our survey. So 92% of our participants were female, 71% were educated to a college or university level or higher, 90% were in employment, and 72% had a household income that would be defined as high based on the Northern Ireland classifications. So I think that's just important to bear in mind when I highlight some of the findings on the next few slides. These are generally a highly educated, employed, and as I say, average household earnings for the majority are in the high threshold. So just a snapshot of some of our findings, and hopefully this paper will be out early in the new year. You can see here some quite stark statistics in relation to the impact of the cost of living crisis on children's physical activity. And again, just encouraging you to bear in mind that these are probably more affluent respondents that have actually taken part in this survey. So 85% of our parents and guardians indicating they were concerned about costs, 40% indicating they couldn't provide something for their child as a result, indicating the impact on their mental health and or their physical health, and that their child had been impacted by the cost of living crisis. And we've a lot more data then that really delves into reduced opportunities for sport. We followed up as well and conducted interviews with these parents. And the next stage of our research then will be to move on and conduct a similar survey amongst providers of sport and physical activity, so amongst sporting organisations across the island of Ireland. So we're hoping to get that study rolled out in the new year. And again, if there's anybody on the webinar this afternoon that would be interested or like to take part in that, do just give us a shout, as we'll be targeting sports clubs early in the new year. So, excuse, I had to throw in one Christmas pun, and we're nearly there. So, to wrap up, although we have observed, I guess, small improvements in children's physical activity, the overall picture is, I suppose, fairly bleak in terms of meeting those guidelines. And there's still a large body of work that needs to be done to really try and shift those population levels and address the observed inequalities that we see across gender, socioeconomic, and status, and so on. It's clear that we need to take a systems-based approach, so a combination of investments are required. And as we've seen firsthand from our own research experiences, the views and experiences of young people themselves should really be central to any of the efforts that we have to try and promote physical activity. So just like to finish by acknowledging all of my collaborators who have worked on this research alongside us, our funders, and of course the participants themselves. And thanks again for the opportunity. Cheers.
Bob. Thank you very much, Angela. I really enjoyed that, and it's not very often you and I get to sit in the same room for an hour to talk about
The same.
research. So yeah, that was really interesting. Thanks very much. Just to remind members of our audience that if you do have any questions for Angela, just pop them into the Q&A area. I just have one question, Angela. It's in relation to your WISH study. And unfortunately, there was no findings in terms of the intervention that this had worked. Did you do any within school analysis in the sense of some schools were quite active to show the potential of the intervention, or?
Yeah, so that's, I suppose, the discussions we were having as a team after the study had finished and we got those. And I suppose we had a predefined analysis plan about how we would go about looking at the data. And that wasn't one of the things we had said from the outset that we would do, but it is certainly a conversation we had following on. The issue was when we sort of tried to consider going down that route was the, I guess, level of information we had on the walks actually being done and performed was quite limited. So we were relying on those walk leader checklists to really quantify how many days a week and how many times a day the walks were taking place. And it became quite clear that there was an issue with sort of how they were being completed. So it didn't really give us a full picture. So there was a question mark over that data, which then would have hampered, I guess, anyway we were able to draw out the high walk schools versus the low walk. So I should have said that probably when I highlighted that graph. We were relying on walk leaders to self-report that, and we knew anecdotally from schools and teachers that they weren't filling that out every day or every week and so on. So we sort of said it's probably not worth pursuing that because there is that question mark over the data.
Sure. And you highlighted some of the challenges within school environment and capturing that. I suppose outside of school, for example, and I don't know if any of your research has touched on this, but could you maybe comment on what role, let's say, parents or the family might play in terms of fostering physical activities, or have you seen any strategies that engages the family or
Yeah.
guardians network?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I suppose the majority of my research has been based on school based, but now that we're seeing that shift to the whole of school approach, part of that is obviously linking in and involving parents and guardians within that. And we've conducted a wide range of qualitative studies where we've interviewed and conducted research with parents and guardians themselves. And it is really apparent the support that parents and guardians provide in order to facilitate physical activity. And the evidence shows us that that comes in a number of forms. It's obviously the social support,
Mm.
exposing them to opportunities, taking part in physical activity with them. All of these have been shown in the evidence to be, correlated or related to levels of physical activity in children. It's the tangible supports as well, the driving them to training, providing kits, equipment, and all of that. And I suppose that's where our cost of living research is really interesting because parents are telling us firsthand there that they've had to cut back and they've had to reduce exposure and opportunities. So I suppose as children move into adolescence, we probably see a decrease in the influence of parents and guardians in relation to their physical activity as they gain more autonomy. And it's then maybe the influence of peers and role models and things that become more apparent. But no, it is clear, if children's parents are meeting the guidelines, they're more likely to meet the physical activity guidelines themselves. So
Mhm. And you referred to some barriers
yeah.
in terms of, you might say barriers in terms of sedentary behavior or attractions, let's say, with screen times and whatnot. Um, I just wondered, looking ahead, if you could implement one initiative to improve children's physical activity across Ireland today, what would that be and why?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question. Yeah. And I probably won't say just one. I think the school environment is not to be dismissed, but I think it's a real shift in terms of the attitudes of everyone when we think about physical activity in the school environment. So when we go in to do all of our research, whoever our first point of contact is goes, I'll pass you through to PE. And we're saying it's not just the
Mhm.
responsibility, and indeed the PE teachers have their own responsibility in delivering PE. There really needs to be a cultural shift in terms of it's everyone's responsibility to promote physical activity to children and adolescents. So I think if we could get schools shifted, and that's all stakeholders, I'm not putting the pressure here just on teachers and themselves, it's everybody involved in that environment to really consider that physical activity is a whole of school issue that should be considered and should be addressed in the way that all other subjects and aspects of the school environment are given consideration. And then more broadly speaking, I guess at the community level, it's availability and access to low cost physical activities and opportunities to try things out informally fun and make activities widely available, reducing many of those barriers that the parents and children have. So I guess money is the main one, funding, but schools, I think, and opportunities within the community are probably the two main areas for this population.
So there's scope to potentially a lot of work that you're doing within the schools to expand within the community levels.
Yeah, yeah. That's what we would hope with those sort of branch out, and it links in sort of community partners as well then, and that whole of school approach.
Okay. And I suppose one final question, just due to time here, is what is the one message you hope that members of our audience today, or those who catch up on this webinar later, take away from your talk today?
Yeah, I suppose it is just that awareness of the low levels of physical activity that we have, particularly, I suppose, if we work in a particular field or discipline where we were maybe only exposed to the high active or the sporty children and adolescents. It's being aware that that's not necessarily representative of the wider population. So yes, the large volume of work we have to do there, particularly looking then at those subgroups where we see those disparities, so our children and adolescents with disabilities, the gender difference, the influence of socioeconomic status, and ensuring that any efforts to promote physical activity are inclusive and consider all of those subgroups within the population as well.
Mhm. Great. Okay, well, Angela, thank you very much. If you could just stay with us for 1 second. Thank you, everyone. Everyone who joined our call stayed on, which is always good news, Angela. So very engaging webinar today. Thank you. Just as a reminder to our audience that our next webinar is taking place on the 30th of January 2025, and that will be with Dr. Eamon Flanagan. So that'll be a really exciting webinar. So make sure you sign up when the details are released. A reminder, keep up to date with everything that is taking place on the ISESA website, our social media channels, etc. And as we head towards the Christmas break, if anyone is thinking of taking a Christmas dip, I would suggest that you catch up in our latest podcast, which Bruce hosted Nuala Moore in Swimming in Extremes, and she provides some really useful tips if you are tempted to take a Christmas dip this coming Christmas. So make sure to check that out. Last thing for me to say is our webinar series for 2024 is coming to a close. Thank you, everyone, our participants, our guest speakers for joining us. It's been a really successful and interesting year of webinars. And no doubt 2025 is going to be just as good. So from all of us at the ISESA, we wish you a very happy, restful Christmas holiday, but it would be remiss of me on today's webinar to also say engage in some physical activity over that Christmas break for good measure. So we'll see you in 2025. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angela.